you know me well enough to be here early. So I'm going to do a little viewing before I started my presentation. So good morning. I'm very excited that all of you are here today to see a little bit of what I have been doing academically this semester. So I wanted to start this presentation with this binder because it's an inspiration from someone in this room who throughout the year has been saying, as I translate it, be the change that you want to be. And saying that if you're going to say something, if you're going to ask something, or if you're going to expect something of somebody, you should be part of that change. So this is my work from that inspiration. And of course, the second inspiration is the Teaching the 4 Skills course that I took in the fall. So the title of my presentation is Beyond the 4 Skills, Looking at 21st Century Skills. And from that course, at the end of it, we have to do a course evaluation, and part of that course evaluation is looking at the objectives. And so one of the objectives for this course is to expand your skills of integrating the 4 skills in your lessons. So while I was taking the course evaluation, I stopped and thought about that, and decided that I hadn't met that objective as well as I would have liked to during that course. So that started me thinking, if there's an objective in this course that I haven't quite met, what else might be in the field around teaching the 4 skills that I didn't get to experience in this course? And so that led me to this presentation, and this graph shows the timeline of behaviorally modern human beings. And behavioral modern humans are those that have complex language. So the purple bar here, all the way to this point, is the 2 skills, listening and speaking. The bright pink is our recorded history when we started to have the 4 skills. It was 3200 BC in Mesopotamia and around 600 BC in Mesoamerica that we invented reading and writing. And this really small orange sliver on the end here indicates about the past 30 years. And in the past 30 years, we've added 2 new skills, viewing and representing. So today I'll be talking about what are the 6 skills, why should English teachers teach the 6 skills, and then I'll go into updating the course from 4 skills to 6 skills. So the 6 skills, as I've talked about a little bit already, are listening and speaking, reading and writing, viewing and representing. We have 3 receptive skills, listening, reading, and viewing, and 3 productive skills, speaking, writing, and representing. So I was in Thailand for my internship, and I went to Thai TESOL. And at Thai TESOL, I decided to focus mostly on the reading skill. And in doing that, I ended up in a couple of workshops and presentations that were around multimodal texts. And in this, I discovered that there's actually 2 more skills, and that's the piece that we were missing. So multimodal texts are texts that have more than one mode of communication. So that might be text, visuals, sound, movement. And examples of multimodal text include books with illustrations, videos, drama, and online newspapers. The illustration here it says, can it text, blog, scroll, Wi-Fi, or tweet? And the answer is no, it's a book. Just to illustrate that today we've moved much further past just books. For example, when I was a child reading newspapers, there was occasionally a picture that would support the text, but when I go and read newspapers today, almost always there's a picture that supports the text. Usually there's a video. Sometimes there are interactive graphs. There was one recently where I could put in my zip code and see how my school did against all the schools in the nation. Or there are surveys which you can input your information and then see how your responses track against the readership of that newspaper. So multimodal texts are texts that combine 2 or more ways of communication. So the question is, why do multimodal texts require additional skills? And one answer is that they require additional skills because it's no longer just alphanumerical recognition or an autographical process. Because we've added different art forms into our communication and different symbols. So understanding more than just the alphanumerical symbols are really important when we're looking at text these days. The second piece is relational space, and this comes from an article by Chan and Chia. And relational space is the realm in between. So it's that space between the visuals and the text, whether the visuals match the text or the text matches the visuals, between different types of modes. It's a space between the learner and the text, so what I bring to the text. It's the space between the author and the text, who the author is, when were they writing, and what context were they writing. And it's also the space between the learner and the author. Multimodal texts have different modalities, contexts, and purposes. So it's that space of navigating what was used to create the text, in what context you're reading it in, what context it was written in, what the purposes are for those texts, and negotiating the meanings in between those. When you're looking at multimodal text, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that there are a lot of different perspectives that you can have when looking at these texts. And there are different levels of meaning, so you could go at it at a very surface level, and just like when you read a book, when you reread it, you come to a different level of understanding. It's the same thing in multimodal text. And so all this space as you're navigating between you and the text and the author and the context in which you're reading it in, you begin to look at identity formation. And identity formation is not something we really talked about in teaching the 4 skills, but it's a crucial part as we ask students to look critically at the text that they're interacting with on a daily basis. Multimodal texts also ask us to look at cultural stories, and cultural stories are the broad narratives throughout history and throughout time that define a culture. They also relate to your personal story or your personal life and the mundane, day-to-day things that we experience. Another piece to multimodal text that's an additional skill is reflexivity. And reflexivity is looking at the visual word link, but it's also reading that text against context, situations, cultures, and belief systems. Reflexivity involves rethinking, reconsideration, and reflection. And when you're looking at multimodal text, you're probably going to ask your students to think about the question, is there an ultimate truth? Because as you read that against socio-political and cultural landscapes, you discover that my understanding of the text and your understanding of the text are really different. And so is there an ultimate truth, or are there different realities that we're all seeing together? The final piece is, when you are looking at multimodal text, you have to build in your students an intercultural awareness. In the video that I started this presentation with, one of the things that jumps out to me that is obvious about intercultural awareness is the choice of color. So there was a blue umbrella and there was a red umbrella, and in America, it generally tracks that blue goes with the male gender and red goes with the female gender. In other cultures, those colors don't respond to those genders. So somebody viewing it in another place might not immediately say, oh, that's a male umbrella, that's a female umbrella. So just building that cultural awareness that there's a difference in how we view things in something as simple as colors is really important. So viewing is the ability to understand, interpret, analyze, and critique multimodal texts. It's also the ability to use computer technology to conduct research. And this is a really important piece because in the past when you had a book, it was generally understood that it was either factual or a large enough group of people believed in what was written in it for it to be published and produced. These days, almost anyone can post anything, and that's not saying that random people aren't experts in what they're posting, but it does make it so that you as the viewer have to read many different things and think critically about whether that source is accurate or relevant to what you're looking at. Viewing is the ability to describe text by using the elements of design, and it's also the ability to describe text by using the elements of electronic media. And I'll go into those a little bit more depth later. But understanding the elements of design and elements of electronic media give you the tools and the vocabulary to understand why people are making the choices they're making as they create text. And if you understand why they're making those choices, then you're able to stop and think about, this is what the author is trying to get me to feel or do or say, and you have that ability to make a choice about whether you're going to do that or not. Viewing is also the ability to understand how images and language interact to convey ideas, values, and beliefs. So we use viewing skills when we encounter drawings or illustrations, maps, media messages, performances, often live, computer graphics, or charts. Just to choose one of those, to look at charts, you can represent numbers in many different ways, and you can represent the same set of numbers and convey widely different messages using those numbers. So it's asking the students to stop and think about how and why they chose to use that set of numbers and to display them the way they did. So there's often text that's involved in that, there's often an image, and so putting those two together and asking them to create some meaning. So the elements of design are balance, color, lines, shape, texture, rhythm, theme and variation, proportion, and contrast. And these are all elements of design, and they are vocabulary items, but when you look at them from this culture and you look at them from other cultures, suddenly where things are placed on the page and how close they are together is going to change. So in languages that read from left to right, the most important things are generally on the left, lesser important things are generally on the right. So having that understanding for students when they come to a text and they're looking at maybe an image and looking at where should my eyes go first is important so that they have an understanding of what the author was trying to intend by placing things on the page the way they did. Similarly, elements of electronic media include camera angles, camera shots, lighting, sound, special effects, and commercials. So to give a couple of examples, camera angles, if someone has shot something from the top, the individual or individuals or objects that are in that shot are suddenly seen as being less powerful. So understanding when you're viewing something that if that camera is above them, why you're feeling like that person has less power is important. Because cameras don't actually capture reality, they capture a version of reality. And making your students aware of this and explaining the ways that they do so will let them be better viewers, and will also let them be better representers. If you think about scary movies and sound, generally when something bad is about to happen, the notes get closer together, it becomes a minor key, and when the music stops, you know that something is about to happen. So using sound to underscore different events that are happening can lead you as a viewer through the piece. And I also put commercials in this because TV commercials in the American industry alone are a $9 billion industry. And commercials are put together to influence you, to message you so that you are doing the things that the companies want you to do. And to have that much power and that much money behind commercials, and them being so prevalent in our society today, it's really important for us as English teachers to make sure that we touch on commercials in our classes so that they understand that what's being presented on that screen is not necessarily reality, and they're trying to get you to do something. So the productive skill that goes with this is representing, and representing is the ability to interpret, analyze, and critique the world, and use these insights to create multimodal text. It's the ability to create, illustrate, construct, photograph, publish, or perform a multimodal text. So those are the verbs that you as a teacher might use when you are talking about the final product that students might create. Representing is the ability to make informed decisions about the use of the elements of design in the production of a multimodal text. So going back to the elements of design, the elements of electronic media, making those choices and being able to tell you as a teacher why they chose to do something the way they did. What message are they trying to convey by doing that? Representing is the ability to use computer technology to create graphics, video, sound, and text. And it's the ability to use images and language to convey ideas, values, and beliefs. And one thing that I was reading while I was researching viewing representing is that it's often the opportunity to empower students to look at the dominant discourse and add in an alternative way of viewing the world. So it's asking them first to identify what their ideas, values, and beliefs are, and then putting them into a message that will be received by the rest of the world and understood as a different way of seeing what's going on. We use representing skills when we create charts, posters, video presentations, visual art, and drama. So the question is, why teach viewing and representing? And these are all questions from Richards and McKenna, and it got me starting to think about why we should actually teach viewing and representing. And the first set of questions has to do with writing, and what does it mean to write something? Does writing presuppose the use of alphanumerical letters? Is an animation that clarifies alphabetic text a part of the composition, an extension, an add-on, or a distinct category of writing? If this animation stands alone without text, should it be considered writing, composition, or something else? And the first time that I was asked this question, I was actually in high school in a program called Regional Fine Arts, and so every other Thursday I would go to a dance studio rather than school. And in this class that I spent all day dancing, the teacher asked us to simply write our names through movement. And then asked us to identify why we chose different movements to represent ourselves and how it meant to write our names. So that question is it writing? Because I'm tracing my name throughout the air, so I'm creating the letters, I'm sending a message, I'm creating a representation of who I am. So does that mean that I wrote something? And I guess I did a little bit of a similar thing in Welt that kind of started as a joke. So I'm going to demonstrate really briefly for you, for those who haven't seen it. So it was language analysis for less language planning. So I created a short dance, very short. And it just traces the letters through the air, but it also tells the story of our Welt class. So it starts something like this with an L, of course, and then an A, and right back to an L, and then a P. So I've told a story, I've wrote the letters, but is that writing? I also fell down the rabbit hole with this one while I was researching and looking into what is a word. And because words look so very different in a wide variety of languages, that led to our emojis words. Because I'm sending either animations or just symbols in a text message, and texting is generally considered writing. Sometimes I'm only sending emojis. I'm sending you a message, you understand what I'm saying. I'm putting oftentimes multiple emojis together, and so the question is that writing. The second set of questions deals with reading. Does reading mean comprehending any message in any form, or only in printed form on paper? Does reading an illustration constitute reading? Is reading a web page the same or different from reading a page in a textbook, and how? And my answer to the first question I think is pretty obvious because I've chosen to add 2 skills to our course, viewing and representing. So I do believe that reading and all the skills that go into that are fairly focused on the text itself. But that viewing matches reading and other modes of communication. So the second question, does reading and illustration constitute reading? Where do you separate reading from viewing? Recently I was in the bookstore looking at a book that almost had a few alphanumerical letters, but not very many. But it told a story through pictures. And does that count as reading, or are we doing something else when we look at that book? And the final question, is reading a web page the same or different from reading a page in a textbook, and how? And you can have the same text on the web page as in the textbook, but the things that you can have in a web page, such as color, video, graphics, you might have sound that accompanies it, how can those come together to support that text in a way that can't be done in a textbook? Final set of questions is, does reading include the ability to process and interpret graphics, the use of color, sound, streaming, video, alphabetic characters, links to related screens, and other media forms? And so thinking about what it means to know a language, and whether reading and writing are just alphanumerical and autographical processes, I looked a little bit at literacy and both what it means to know a language and what it means to be literate in a language. Richards and McKenna say that literacy is based on the various social practices cultures use to communicate. And so looking at this word cloud, it includes both speaking and listening. It includes reading and writing, but it also includes the ability to view and represent. In 2014, the numbers have gone up slightly. For every minute of the day, over 300 hours of video for YouTube were uploaded, and that's on a single site alone. So the amount of representing that we are doing, that our students are doing, is a large portion of how they spend their lives, viewing and representing themselves. So literacy, to me, is not only just the ability to read and write and produce things, but also to put different modes of communication together. So as I look into the future, thinking about why I should be teaching viewing and representing, the first piece is that it's an access and a way to start talking about culture with our students that is less ethnocentric and more ethno-relativistic. Because you're able to talk about simple things like the use of line and the use of color that are often very far removed from emotion, and allow them to see that people think and talk in different ways, and that these ways are not better or worse than, but just different. It also allows you to see different places in the world, to see how people choose to represent themselves, and start that conversation with your students about how do you choose to represent yourself here in the classroom. The second big piece that I was thinking about is access, because I taught for 2 years in a very small island in the middle of the ocean where we didn't have much access to things like the internet or fast-paced communications. And I was thinking, as I was going through this presentation, did I teach viewing and representing while I was there? And I discovered that the answer is yes, because we did have access to books, and we also had solar panels that charged a car battery that often was used to light the house during night. But that same car battery could be used to charge portable DVD players instead. So often my host mother would decide that a DVD was a little bit more important than light during the nighttime, and she would be watching a Korean soap opera, and the Korean soap opera was then dubbed in English, and I would be doing something else, but she would want to tell me and summarize the story and tell me the story in Mortlockese. So it's gone through a couple different cultures, a couple different languages before it arrives when she's representing it to me, and I'm trying to figure out what happened in this story. So those are two different ways that these people on a very small island view. And I was also thinking about how they represent. And they do so through song, and they do so through drama. In a very gender-stratified culture, where males have male roles that they almost never step out of, and females have female roles that they almost never step out of, in different ways of dressing and acting and behaving, suddenly this space of drama and of representing themselves in a different way opens up those gender roles. And so they have the ability to cross-dress, they have the ability to move and act like a woman does. And when I'm working with my students, I have then the opening to say, well, how did you feel when you wore that dress? How did you feel when you walked that way? Why did you choose to wear the clothing you did? So I'm teaching them to think critically about what they're doing and how they're doing it. So even in far-flung places on the world where you might not have access to internet, it's still important to teach viewing and representing skills to your students. The third fairly large piece is talking about media literacy. And I've already talked a little bit about reconstructing reality, but that concept that when you're choosing to represent or when you are viewing something, being aware that that reality is not necessarily the reality other people are seeing or your reality. Media literacy is being aware that all of the messages that we're being sent every day are trying to influence our perceptions of the world. I looked at a variety of curriculums across the world, and in one from Canada, it asked the teachers to create conscious, critical, and appreciative readers of visual media. In that same curriculum, it was looking for teachers to help students to become effective creators of visual products. So these skills are something that are also already being talked about in a variety of countries and are already part of the curriculum. So bringing it back to SIT so that we're prepared to go out into the world, I think is really an important thing to be doing. And finally, media literacy is the material. The reason that we should be looking at it is that material of media culture is so polymorphous, multivalent, and polysemic that it necessitates sensitivity to different readings, interpretations, perceptions of the complex images. If you have done any research into media literacy, you will quickly discover that there are a wide variety of definitions of what media literacy is. Kellner and Scher did a literature review, and they came up with 5 things that either appear in most definitions of media literacy or are prevalent enough to be included in this list. The first being recognition of the construction of media and communication as a social process, as opposed to accepting text as isolated, neutral, or transparent conveyors of information. And that's a long way to say that in Western education, we generally view text as decontextualized things. So when we ask students to read text, we're asking them to answer what in the elementary world we call right there questions. And so if you have a text, those are things that you can point to and say, here's the answer right here, it's in this line. And we also ask them to answer questions that are think and search questions. So they might have to look in paragraph 1 and then paragraph 3 and pull things from both paragraphs, put them together to get the answer. In Eastern education, and we're moving this way in Western education, we're now asking students to think about author and me questions. So that answer might not necessarily be on the page, but you have to think about what the author was thinking about and how you view the world and how those two things come together. So you're suddenly putting that text back into context. What was that author thinking about? What were they feeling? What were they experiencing when they were reading this text? When they were writing this text, sorry. And the fourth set of questions is the world and me. So this is putting it back into context and saying, here's this text, what does it mean to me? My past experiences that I've brought to it, how does that affect my meaning? And where am I going to take it from here? The second part to media literacy is the textual analysis that explores the language, genres, codes, and conventions of the text. And that's a lot looking at the elements of design, elements of electronic media, and how that interacts with the text that we put together. The third piece, an exploration of the role audiences play in negotiating meaning. For those of you who have read a little bit about reader response theory is solely my lived past experiences and how that interacts with the text. So it's removing the author, it's removing the social and political and cultural landscape that the text was written in, and solely what do I know and what am I bringing to that text. So this part being in here is really about the idea that audiences are going to create their own meanings from the text, and that those meanings are going to be perhaps different from what the author intended when they were creating the text. The fourth piece of the media literacy is problematizing the process of representation to uncover and engage issues of ideology, power, and pleasure. And this part of the definition of media literacy is actually more of a newer piece to the definition of media literacy. The first three have been there probably since about 30 years ago. This one I started seeing within the last 10 years or so. And I think it's an outgrowth of Paulo Freire's work in asking for teachers and students to be more aware and critical of the text that they're consuming, and how can that empower us to change things and to change our circumstances around us. So asking the students to think about when you have a scene and there's lighting involved. Of course the lighting is illuminating things, but it's also covering in darkness other things that are surrounding that issue. So making students aware that those things are being hidden and asking them who is being represented in this, who is not being represented, how are they being represented, and is that a dominant discourse, is it an alternative discourse? You're getting to start critically thinking about how that media is put together. The fifth piece is the examination of the production and institutions that motivate and structure the media industries as corporate profit-seeking businesses. And if you've been reading the news in the past week or so, a really great example of this is how Facebook decides what's trending. So Facebook decides what's trending by a series of algorithms that hopefully predict a little bit in advance what is going to be really big news, and then it puts it on a list on the side of your Facebook page. The piece that has been in the news recently is that in addition to these algorithms, which we generally accept as fact-finding things that are generally true, descriptive of what is happening in the world, there are people involved at every stage. And Facebook is a rather giant company. These people are employers, and they have the opportunity to look at what these algorithms are putting out and make a decision. Does it actually go on our trending list, or are we going to put it somewhere else? And it has been in the past couple of weeks that Facebook has been leaning more to the left than down the center. People are asking if you're going to claim that you're part of the news cycle to be a little bit more in the middle. So critical media literacy, which is again from that fourth bullet point. Keller and Chain say, when media is seen as merely transparent windows, the messages become naturalized. We become complacent, and democracy ceases to be representative. Our dependency on media surrenders our active participation in civic duties to question, challenge, and correct social injustices. Radical democracy depends on individuals caring about each other, being involved in social issues, and working together to build a more egalitarian, less oppressive society. So I'm hoping that with the amount of teachers in this room, that when you go into your classrooms, that you're not just simply teaching media literacy, but you're teaching critical media literacy, that you're looking to empower students, you're looking to make them aware of what's happening in this world and how people are being represented or viewed in this world, and how these choices, not only in language, but also the other modes of communication, make it so that we don't think twice about what we're seeing. So getting those students to stop and think twice about what they're seeing is really important. So moving into this final part of my presentation, looking at updating the 4 skills to the 6 skills, I thought I'd start with a quote from Tell. And Tell says, "We are expanding the definition of what literacy means. Students read and interpret not just words on the page, but also icons on the computer screen, images on TV, and graphs and charts in newspapers. But although we incorporate different kinds of literacies into the classroom, we do not eliminate any of the old literacies. We still expect students to read and write in the traditional way." So I thought I'd start with a 20th century quote to work with Elizabeth, because she's been so kind in allowing me to go into Moodle and take all sorts of different pieces from thinking of 4 skills, because it is still really critical that we teach listening, speaking, reading, and writing in addition to viewing and representing. So in my scope and sequence, we have 15 classes broken down into 3 hours each, and originally we had 3 to 4 days for each skill, and a couple of days for different things. But with my scope and sequence, I broke it down into 2 days for each skill, so that would be a 12-day total, and 2 days for theory, and a day for course synthesis and action plans. One piece that's new in the theory section is the narrative theory framework. It's on the 2nd day of theory, and it's after we have seen reading, listening, and viewing. And it asks students to look at both the text and the other modes of communication, and first to look at the narrator. And this is more for stories that students would be engaging with. And when you're looking at the narrator, is it a narrator who is reliable? Is the narrator part of the story or slightly removed from the story? Is it first person, second person, third person? And why is the author making these choices to convey the messages that they're conveying? The second piece that you'll look at with the narrative theory framework is characters. Who are they? The blue umbrella and the red umbrella. But we didn't really see the humans underneath them until almost the very end. The action, and action is simply what happens in the story, those big pieces that you would retell if you were summarizing the story to somebody else. Time, which I think is really interesting when we are viewing different pieces. Is it a steady story throughout? Does it suddenly stop and the moment expands, giving you the opportunity to step in and look around at what is happening in that story, what that character might be thinking in the moment? Or is it fast-paced all the way through? And the final piece is setting. And setting not only means the setting of the story, where that story is taking place, what time, but also the setting that you are reading it in. Because if I'm sitting in a classroom, the things that I'm learning and taking away from that reading are very different than if I'm reading it on my own for my own pleasure. It also asks you to look at the setting of the author. We talked a little bit about that social, political, and cultural landscapes that we're reading the text against. So the new module is viewing, and in each module, the first day we talk about what's happening in the field, and then we do a sample lesson. The second day is reserved for looking at different activities that you might do with low, medium, and high students, and also looking at a variety of different things, different actual hard skills that you'll need to teach your students. So to talk a little bit about the sample lesson that I would use for viewing, the first thing that is really important and jumps out to me when I watch the blue umbrella is lines. As humans, we have that innate thing when we look at something and we see two circles and a line, we automatically see a face, which in this, all the pieces in the environment had what I recognize as faces on them. And originally when we start, there are the two eyes, and the line is fairly flat for almost everything that is in the environment. As the two umbrellas meet, and there's that happy moment, all the lines suddenly go a little upturned. And up generally means happy, and an upturned line generally indicates a smile. And if you remember, the umbrellas met and then they parted, and in that parting there was that, sadness, and all of a sudden those lines, which were upturned, are now downward. And down generally indicates the emotion of sadness in American culture. It also indicates a frown. So you've got all these pieces of the environment that are reflecting the emotions that the Disney creators want you to feel. So just that simple use of line, which is just flat or upturned or downturned, suddenly has a huge impact on how you're reacting to what's happening in the screen. The second one being color, which we've already talked about a little bit, blue tracking with male, red tracking with female. But looking at, might have been a little bit more subtle, how much lighting and what tone of blue was being used and what tone of red was being used. It's a little darker shades of blue and red, even though it's the same umbrella, when things were sadder. And in the end, when that red umbrella came over the blue umbrella, those colors brightened up, just to indicate a little bit of a happier feeling. Sound, the video started with just the rain. And then as the rain started and the first character came up, that's when the music started to indicate that that's the piece that you should be looking at. Now we're going to follow with the music and with the umbrella his story throughout the piece. You might